Hello, YouTubers. Welcome to Real Turkey Channel by Atilla Yaşalada, your loving, tender presenter. And we talk about Turkish policy, economics, and business news. I am going to spend a few seconds to make sure the strange space studio is properly recording and then get down right to the business. And the business today is the upcoming American presidential elections, or Senate elections for that matter, Biden versus Trump. You may wonder why a YouTube channel which pretends to cover Turkish politics, economy, and business may be interested in this topic, or whether it has any expertise in covering this topic. You are quite right. American elections are the problem of the American people. They decide who is best for them, Mr. Trump or Mr. Biden. Neither do I speculate on the results of the elections, but I do read the polls, and Mr. Biden seems to lead Mr. Putin. Oh, Jesus, Freudian slip. I am really sorry. Mr. Trump, not only in popular votes, but also in electoral college votes. Now, this is America's business, as I've said, but a thought exercise on who will win, Biden or Trump, is very important for some nations and for markets as well as the business community. It is very important for nations like Russia, where Mr. Putin has just declared himself or has been elected president for life. I am sorry. The elections were obviously free and fair. There can be no doubts about that. And Turkey, of course, where Mr. Recep Tayyip Erdogan is doing his best to destroy what remains of democracy. For that reason, and the fact that there are a series of substantive conflicts or misunderstandings between Turkey and the United States, the results of the elections matter greatly to Turkey. They also matter greatly to the EM markets, though that's not entirely my focus today. I will mention how Mr. Biden's presidency or potential presidency may impact emerging markets, but essentially I want to focus on the difference between Trump and Biden when it comes to Mr. Erdogan and Turkey's economic policies and the future of the Turkish economy. Okay, for a starter, as I've said, I don't wager or produce my own predictions on the outcome of elections. I merely read the polls. I also read poll of polls tables, like 538, The Economist and Financial Times have compiled a list of polls, all of which show Mr. Biden way ahead of Mr. Trump. Of course, things can change. But it's useful to conduct a thought exercise as to how Mr. Biden's presidency will differ from Mr. Trump's presidency vis-à-vis Turkey. Mr. Trump is currently Turkey's only friend in Washington, D.C. Not only is the Congress against Turkey's current set of policies and the way these are manifested, but also Pentagon, and in my view, to the extent I can decipher American politics, the entire American policymakers have an antagonistic view of Turkey. You may ask why this is the case. Well, clearly, Turkey's recent rapprochement to Russia has ruffled some feathers in Washington, D.C., in particular Turkey's decision to purchase and take delivery of Russian-made S-400 anti-missile systems has angered congressmen and women. It has also angered NATO, but NATO is usually much more polite and diplomatic when it expresses concerns. The prevailing Western view of Turkey's purchase of these S-400s is that Turkey is a NATO member. Therefore, when it comes to sophisticated weaponry, it should only purchase NATO-compatible military assets. Moreover, there are, I think, reasonable concerns that once activated, these S-400 missile batteries can hack into the existing NATO assets in Turkey, such as the airplanes in the Incirlik Air Base. There is a radar station which monitors parts of Russia and Central Asia in Krecik, Malatya, etc., etc. But there are other issues as well. Of course, American prisoners in Turkey, which Americans consider political prisoners, and the current sentencing of the recent sentencing of consular employee Mr. Metin Topuz to 9.5 years in prison for espionage and aiding and abetting a terror organization are angering United States. There is also a court case in a New York federal court, Southern District, I believe, about Halkbank, a state-owned commercial bank in Turkey, where the charges are that Halkbank has aided several nefarious actors to violate sanctions on Iran and to help these persona to smuggle more than $13 billion worth of gold and goods to Iran in violation of the existing UN and United States sanctions. Turkey, of course, has problems with the United States too. First, the inspiring person or the coordinator behind the 2016, I believe, God, times pass so quickly, 2016 aborted coup attempt. The Sunni preacher, Mr. Fethullah Gülen, still resides in Pennsylvania. Turkey's extradition requests have fallen on deaf ears. More importantly, there hasn't even been an official investigation to judge whether Turkey's accusations are true or not. In my view, Mr. Gülen is a political actor, not a religious figure, and he is still conspiring to undermine the democratically elected regime of Mr. Erdogan, despite all of its shortcomings and failures. Coups are not good. I don't support coups, no matter who does them, who undertakes them, or whatever the purpose might be. Also, the United States is an ally of the Syrian Kurds called PYD, YPG. One of them is the political organization, the other one is the militia, which has very close links to the PKK terror organization. Now, I personally don't think, the Syrian Kurds are terrorists or anything like that, or that the entire political arm of this organization is part of PKK, as Turkey claims, but nevertheless, Turkey has good reasons to suspect that alliance. Americans, on the other hand, think or, have evidence that YPD-PYG is an effective weapon against ISIS and has really cleared the southwest of Syria from the ISIS menace. Therefore, they continue supporting this YPD, the Syrian Kurdish entity. I am really sorry. There are other problems as well. I mean, just the list runs the whole gamut. So far, United States Senate wanted to impose sanctions on Turkey under the aegis of the CAATSA law for buying and installing but not activating S-400s. In fact, the House of Representatives have passed that bill. In Senate, Democrats and Republicans were arguing about the merits and disadvantages of punishing Turkey when COVID-19 struck, and the whole debate was quashed because American congresspeople had more important matters to do. On the other hand, Mr. Trump, for reasons I can't quite comprehend, is a good friend with Putin, with Mr. Erdogan, and he doesn't like Ms. Merkel. I don't know why. And this friendship has really worked out for Turkey. Turkey is not yet punished for S-400s, as I've said. Mr. Trump is withdrawing the military forces from Syria and Iraq, which provides a broader maneuvering room to Turkish military to deal with PKK and with the Syrian Kurds, for good or bad. Again, no judgment involved. And if John Bolton is to be believed, which I really don't know if he's to be believed, Mr. Erdogan has asked Mr. Trump to intervene in the Halkbank trial. And one of the reasons why the public attorney, public prosecutor for the Southern District of New York, Mr. Berman, was sacked from his job was the Halkbank case. I'm not saying that's the only case, that's the only reason, but that's probably one of the reasons. So Mr. Trump has been, very good to Mr. Erdogan. There's another thing. Obama had a very proactive democracy policy. His presidency favored democratic regimes over non-democratic ones, and usually using the method of suasion or polite criticism, the Obama presidency tried to shape these autocratic or anti-democratic regimes. Trump couldn't care less. So if Biden is elected, could any of these change? Yes, obviously I haven't, read through the full Senate voting record of Mr. Biden, but I have read several studies, one by a Sabancı University professor, Mr. McDonald, I believe, I hope I'm not mispronouncing his name, who gives a very comprehensive account of how Biden thinks about Mr. Erdogan and Turkey at large. If I understand it correctly, and again, this is my interpretation of what Mr. McDonald has written, not his words, that Biden understands the importance of Turkey and its politics very well, and he thinks Turkey is on the wrong path, that Mr. Erdogan is doing a disservice to Turkey by removing the pillars of democracy. Now, clearly, Mr. Biden might have his hands full with COVID-19 and engineering an economic recovery or rescuing thousands of small businesses that are currently going bankrupt and helping the millions of unemployed. Perhaps he might even be struggling if the Senate remains under Republican control. But there's a valid case to be made that if Biden wins, his coattails would also carry the Senate to Democrats. And after the first term of the Obama, he will be the first president who will have the Congress potentially cooperating with him rather than resisting him. So under these circumstances, I expect Mr. Biden to take a more proactive role in international diplomacy. I expect him, again, my interpretation of his public statements, I expect Mr. Biden to return to Paris Protocol for climate change control and the dispute with World Trade Organization and World Health Organization, and be more cooperative with NATO, EU, and the United Nations, which are, actually classic American policy positions. He will probably come down harsher on people like Bolsonaro, Putin, and Erdogan. Now, far be it from me to comment on, what Biden and Putin might do together, but when it comes to Turkey, I have fairly good understanding of where the United States would object to Turkish policy and what it would want Turkey to do and what the penalties would be if Turkey fails to cooperate with the United States. Obviously, the most important issue is the S-400s, which is actually a litmus test of whether Turkey belongs to NATO or is an embedded spy in NATO actually working for Russia. Turkey will be asked in no uncertain terms to pack away those S-400s and potentially send them outside the country, though I'm not so sure about the last part. And unless it does so, it will be subjected to CAATSA sanctions. These will probably start very mildly. That is, the president has a choice from a menu of sanctions that Congress implements. Mr. Biden would probably start with the weakest of these sanctions, making sure it doesn't hurt the Turkish economy and doesn't give Mr. Erdogan a reason to use that to consolidate his voter base. But some kind of sanctions are very likely. I think the Halkbank case will be allowed to run its natural course. Again, I'm not a jurist or a legal scholar. I can't, comment on who will win. But again, the sources I read claim that there's a good chance that Halkbank would lose this case, in which case it would be subject to very large monetary penalties. People are talking about numbers like $10 billion, which is like 10 times Halkbank's paid in capital. And if Halkbank doesn't pay, then because it's owned by the state, the treasury has to pay, or there will be financial sanctions on Turkey. I think Biden would also want Turkey to be more cooperative in Syria. There are certain areas where American and Turkish policy overlap, which is trying to get rid of Assad and making sure that the ISIS virus doesn't make a comeback. But Turkey would be asked to cooperate with Kurds or to be more lenient on Kurds in return for a promise to crack down on PKK. And if Turkey doesn't, accept this compromise, I think once again the United States Congress may pass additional sanctions laws based on allegations that not the Turkish military, to the best of my knowledge, but Turkey's proxies, the Free Syrian Army, have committed atrocities and war crimes in the last Turkish incursion in northeast Syria called Operation Peace Spring. And of course, again, I don't know what kind of methods or means Mr. Biden or the Congress might deploy, but they would take a more active role in Turkey's domestic politics and would object strenuously and at times very loudly if Mr. Erdogan broadens the ongoing crackdown. You may ask what crackdown that is. The latest effort is the split Turkey's bar associations into pro-AKP and anti-AKP factions, and honor or give a more prominent role to pro-AKP bar associations, which is currently meeting stiff resistance by lawyers. As I speak, there are very large protests by attorneys in Istanbul, Izmir, and Mersin. Turkey would be asked to return to democracy, but as I've said, I really don't know what kind of sanctions or what sort of means a Biden presidency might deploy to castigate or chastise Turkey. Now, of course, even if I'm correct in my thesis that Joe Biden would be very antagonistic to Erdogan and would be much more proactive in terms of objecting to Erdogan's conduct, sanctions are really not necessary to cause market fallout. In the past, we have seen, such as in the case of Trump demanding the release of American pastor Mr. Andrew Brunson, to which Mr. Erdogan first resisted but later gave up, the talk of sanctions, the threat of sanctions are enough to cause a currency shock. Turkey's currency is only held up by central bank selling gross reserves. It inflates its balance sheet to show its FX reserves higher than they actually are, but that's again another video. You may see my past videos about central bank reserves. But given this fragility and the fact that Turkey is losing the entire tourist season and thus will produce current account deficits, the threat of sanctions from Biden or the perception that these sanctions might be upcoming are going to be deleterious for Turkey's market performance. And if the currency goes, so does the inflation and the balance sheets of many large and medium-sized Turkish corporates who have overtaken excessive FX leverage. So there's a lot Biden could do to hurt Mr. Erdogan and Turkey's economy. The big question, of course, which I'm not able to answer at this point, is how Mr. Erdogan would play this game. I know for sure that neither Putin nor Mr. Erdogan would cause trouble to the United States until the elections are resolved. If Trump remains president, then I think both Russia and Turkey would have much broader operating room in foreign policy. Whether this flexibility is used for reasons that may satisfy America or not is a different debate. And Mr. Erdogan would feel much freer to pursue the kind of policies he's currently pursuing at home in terms of the crackdown, anti-democratic laws, heterodox economic policies, etc., etc. But I'm not so sure how he would get along with Biden. There are those that Turkey will continue to resist, and in fact, the Biden presidency might be the last straw that causes Turkey to completely abandon NATO and the Western axis. And there are others who claim that Mr. Erdogan is aware of the extreme fragility of the Turkish economy and his primary objective being a recovery in Turkish economy, he will play along with Biden. Again, national interests, not a concern for this video. From an economic perspective, a Trump presidency is good for Turkey. A Biden presidency is bad for Turkey if Mr. Erdogan refuses to cooperate with Biden. That's all I have to say for today. And if I sound and look a little bit distracted, it's because I need to constantly monitor the audio level here, as well as whether this darn thing is recorded. But soon, even though COVID is not completely suppressed in Turkey, we will start our live broadcasts again. There will be a different background and hopefully more merriment in terms of content. This was Atilla Yeşilada for Real Turkey Channel reporting from Istanbul. Have a safe day. Bye-bye now.